So I also have to open with an apology, kind of like Ran. I'm going to try to do in 30 minutes what I usually fail to do in 2 hours. So I'm going to give this in very broad strokes. I'm going to try to explain to you a little bit about the Bitcoin protocol, because I have to use that as a basis for explaining about a problem with the protocol and something that we think we can do about it. So this is going to be a very small change, and we have a lot of work on the way. This is all, by the way, joint work with Yonatan Sompolinsky, who's a student of mine and is largely responsible for all the math that I dropped out of the talk. So, let's get started. Okay, so first let me try and explain what Bitcoin is and what's new about it. So Bitcoin is a decentralized digital currency, and I emphasize decentralized here because we already have digital money in all sorts of forms. It was invented by a guy calling himself Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008, who started running it in 2009. His exact identity is unknown, but the system has been running successfully for quite a while, and it's open source. And Bitcoin was really built for the age of the internet. It was designed to be money that is cheap to transfer and very easy, just as easy as sending a text message. Which is very different than our conventional money transmission means. If you think of credit cards, we cannot pay each other with credit cards, for example. They have fees associated with them that we usually don't feel, but maybe the merchant does. So Bitcoin was trying to do something better in this realm that we already know in our intuition, I think, that could somehow work better. So what is the main idea in Bitcoin? So in traditional digital money, what you have is a centralized source. I depict it here as a bank, but you can think of a computer server that you communicate with, and basically you give it messages saying something like transfer $1 from my account to somebody else. And this central mediator that does all of our accounting for us usually is in the position to take fees, to be regulated. This is a sort of a central point where the system starts to slow down and become expensive, not because centralized systems are harder to build, but rather because this is an economic central point where you can increase fees. You don't have many alternatives, or the government can come in and request that this bank check every transfer that goes abroad to make sure it's not money laundering, for example. So Bitcoin's goal is to take this and replace this central mediator with a distributed network. And this distributed network is going to be built in a way that every small participant here, and these are actually servers, is going to be very weak. They're going to compete against each other, which will hopefully really lower our fees. But also, they are going to be very hard to regulate, because this is going to be a global network spread out all across the world. You can't show up with a court order and ask one of these nodes on its own to seize someone's bank account, because you will basically have to have the consensus and the consent of the majority of the network at least. Okay, so this is the main goal of Bitcoin. And you can really see it as a kind of continuation of a line of projects that was on the crypto-anarchistic agenda, basically trying to increase personal freedom through the use of cryptography. So projects like Tor and PGP and BitTorrent have tried to kind of release information from the government's control and to kind of deregulate its use. Bitcoin goes a step further, realizing that information can also be used to represent money. So we can kind of free money from the government or the centralized mediators and distribute the flow of money. So this is a very ambitious undertaking, I suppose. So Bitcoin really aims to bypass all regulation. It really wants to increase the competition to the point where the fees are really low. And it aims to be disruptive to the current banking system. So whether or not it succeeds is going to be really a big question. And it has a lot of challenges in front of it, right? So the first challenge will be adoption. Money isn't worth anything unless people start using it. Okay, so Bitcoin has very few people who use it. I would venture to say that most people in the room probably don't own Bitcoins. Regulators have to decide what to do with it. They've started to have their say about it. In the US, it was The IRS just announced recently that Bitcoin is to be taxed in a certain way as a commodity and not as a currency, which is viewed as a very bad thing for Bitcoin. But at least there is some regulation. The currency itself is very volatile, which is something that you don't want out of money. If you have, I don't know, a monthly paycheck due to you, but the value of this paycheck oscillates really quickly, that's not very useful for money. And the last question is scalability. The question of whether the system can really grow to become a very large currency that is used all around the world. And I think as computer scientists, we have a lot to say about pretty much all of them, but the easiest point of entry, I think, is the last, is scalability. So whether the system can grow or not is the question that is the subject of this talk. So this is a graph of the number of transactions per day that Bitcoin is processing currently, and actually in the last year. So you can see that although Bitcoin has been a lot in the news, you may have heard about it quite a lot, and its dollar value has moved quite a lot. The number of transactions per day in the last year has not changed significantly, right? So in terms of value, it's gone between $20 to $1,200 in December, I think. But the number of transactions per day, which is not a sign of economic adoption because we don't know how much really how much value is moved here, but this is more of a systems look at the problem, right? There's a number of messages that the system has to process per day. This has remained pretty much the same. Okay, so if we look at Bitcoin, what does this really mean? So Bitcoin pretty much, what these numbers translate to is maybe 1 transaction per second or that order of magnitude. And PayPal and Visa, for example, the payment processors that we'd really like to replace in some sense, have a much higher capacity for traffic. So PayPal processes, according to their own publication, maybe 100 transactions per second. That's the order of magnitude. I can't really stand by these numbers. And Visa claims to have maybe around 2,000. And these are just the averages. These are not at peak times, right? Peak times could be even worse. So the question that we really have to ask ourselves is Bitcoin able to have these order of magnitudes of scaling up, and can it still perform what it does? So before we can answer the question, of course, I have to kind of tell you a little bit about the protocol and how it works. And here's the main idea, right? It's going to be very brute, I suppose. We start with the nodes having the data structure that has all the account information. Basically, think of it for a moment as account information. And this information is now replicated throughout the network. So everybody has all the information, and this will allow us to have everybody check up on each other, make sure that money transfers are being done. Everybody will be able to authorize new transfers of money and so on. So this replication, this is something, when we're talking about scalability, that already looks a little bit suspicious, right? Because this is not the way that we would think of building a scalable system. But this is what Bitcoin does. It replicates information. When somebody wants to transfer information, just like in the centralized banking model, where you would tell your bank, please give money from my account to this other person, or where you would tell Visa to do this, you create a message and send it to the network. And this message just is sent around, is flooded to all of the nodes. And we can now use this maybe to say the blue agent gives money to the red one. Let's change the account balances here. Okay, so that's what Bitcoin basically tries to do. And the problem with distributed systems of this sort is that, of course, somebody might try and get them to become inconsistent. We have a data structure that's replicated everywhere. As long as all of the account balances in all of the nodes are in agreement, we're fine. But what happens when somebody, like this red agent here, produces conflicting messages? In one message, he says, let's give all of my money, all of my one coin to this blue guy. And in one message, he says, let's give my coin to the green guy. And he sends these messages to different parts of the network. Okay? So obviously now we have no ability to accept both of them. Otherwise, he's been using his money twice. This essence of a problem of synchronization between different parts of the network is called the doublespend problem, and is really the thing that Bitcoin aims to solve. Okay, so if we can decide on which of these two transactions to accept, and we don't really care about which one, then we're fine, but we are not allowed to accept both of them. So the way Bitcoin solves this problem is, or rather, let's start with the way it represents information. Bitcoin represents all of these account balances not as account balances, but instead Bitcoin usually saves, what it does is it saves a record of all past transactions that were authorized. So this is so think of it as a running log of all money transfers from point A to point B. And if you read this from start to finish, then you can have a pretty good picture of where all the money is and what the account balances are. And you can try and authorize new transactions. So this data structure is called the blockchains. These individual batches of transactions are called blocks. And every time you want to add a new set of transactions to this log, what you basically do is you try to create a new log, a new block. You listen to transactions that are flooded through the network, as I've shown you, and you try to put them in this block. If something comes along which is contradictory, right, this red agent trying to pay both the blue and the green, you don't allow this second transaction to come in. So you just pick the first one. And of course, the double spend problem manifests itself by the fact that somebody else, some other node in the network, might also try to create a block, and that this block might contain that conflicting transaction that we have really thrown out. So these are now can be thought of as two versions of the history of what actually happened, and we need to pick one. Okay, this is well, I'm going to also call this a fork in the blockchain. So this fork is really two alternative histories, and we need to settle on one of them. If we have decided that this one is the right history and all nodes have accepted the same one, then we're fine. We have account balances that match. So to do so, Bitcoin has a very simple and elegant, I suppose, way of deciding, coming to consensus on the set of transactions. Basically, it comprises of two general rules. The first one is to make block creation really hard. And that's done by requiring nodes that create blocks to solve a very hard computational problem, basically to provide us with a proof of work. So making block creation hard will mean that very few blocks are created simultaneously in the network. So we're going to have fewer conflicts. That's already a very nice thing. But every time we do have conflicts, we're going to use this second rule of Bitcoin. When we create a block, when we create this addition to the log, we're going to send it to all our neighbors, and they can decide if they accept it or not, if they accept that block or not. And they will always accept blocks if they make up a longer chain than they currently have. So let me try and illustrate this for a second, just to give you the intuition of how it works. OK, so let's suppose a block is created by this node who solved this very hard computational problem. It can then send it to the entire network, and they adopt it because they have nothing that is conflicting, nothing that represents a longer chain. Okay, this is supposedly built on top of a shared chain. One of the blocks, one of the nodes might create a block on top of that right here, and might also start to send these blocks out to the network. But in some cases, we will have another conflicting block created by another node. This is not necessarily malicious. Just somebody who hasn't heard of block B1 might create another different one on top of B2, maybe containing different transactions. Some of them might be conflicting. And so we are going to have to decide between these two versions of history. So of course, these blocks might also propagate to the network to some degree. And we have a conflict. OK, so now life goes on. If these messages are sent across nodes here, none of them will accept the other's block because the conflict does not give us a longer chain. So we are left with whatever we are currently holding. But blocks are now continuously built on top of these. So some other node will build a block. OK, somebody else will build a third one. Again, they will send it to their neighbors, which will happily accept it. Everybody holding the same version of history is happy. But also, these guys, if we show them our longer chain, they will abandon their view of history and adopt the current one that we already have. Okay, so now we've reached consensus in some sense. We didn't have to do it, it didn't have to happen in one step. Maybe they would have built a third block and so on. But block creations are really random events that we cannot predict in advance. So they will be, at some point, there will be somebody with a longer chain, and hopefully they will manage to take over the network. Okay, so this is the basics of the Bitcoin protocol. So now, what I've just shown you is that there was a payment that appeared here, somebody who got money supposedly. It was accepted by some of the nodes in the system. And when you look at the system a little while afterwards, this thing is completely gone. The money that I supposedly had in my account has disappeared. So this is something that should be troubling, but what Satoshi guarantees in his original work is that as long as an attacker, even a malicious attacker that has less than 50% of the computing power in the network, the probability of such a replacement will go down exponentially with time. So if we wait a little bit, and we see that we have money, meaning that it is inside a block, and we wait a little bit longer, at some point it will be very, very unreasonable that we will ever have this money taken out. Okay, so this is what Bitcoin does and how it works. So now, what would an attacker do to use this mechanism of block replacement? How does this exactly work? This is called the Doublespend attack in Bitcoin. And so we might try to use this accept a longer chain rule to reverse a payment. So let's suppose I have my payment right here, and an attacker suddenly shows up having a longer chain of blocks, and now the entire network will adopt his longer chain. And instead of having the payment that goes to me, I'm the blue agent, maybe the money goes to somebody else. Okay, so he's just managed to use maybe the coin twice. So because this is, if I've waited long enough, there are many blocks in this chain, and the attacker will have to have a lot of blocks in his. And I remind you that every block is very hard to create. You need a very difficult computation done to produce each one of them. So what Satoshi basically shows is that this is very unlikely that he will find such a long chain of blocks. So now what I want to say is that Satoshi analyzed this exact situation where the honest network's blocks are built on top of each other really nicely and really well, and that there are no forks in the network that are due to the delay that I've just shown you, right? I've just shown you a situation where blocks B1 and B2 might just create a fork and delay the network. So what we do is basically we analyze this situation when the network doesn't behave as well as Satoshi assumed. So one more thing that I want to tell you is that the space inside blocks is limited. Due to bandwidth constraints and other reasons, we cannot put as many transactions as we want in blocks. We have to actually send them to the network. So transactions offer a fee in order to get into a block. And the way to decide which transactions go in is basically by whoever pays the highest. Right? If you pay more fees, then I'm going to put you in the block. And this incentivizes the block creation. Those computers that are working to create blocks get paid out of this, but also makes sure that the right transactions go in and not ones that are just moving money with low priority. So now what I want to show you is basically this. If Bitcoin ever succeeds and there is demand for many transactions per day, but still Bitcoin is unable to process these transactions, there's low throughput in the system, then we're going to reach a situation where there are high fees, right? And people will either pay these high fees, which will probably be higher than Visa maybe, or they will migrate for Bitcoin and not adopt it, right? They will move to a different currency. So this is in essence what we're trying to solve. And another related question to this is can Bitcoin be faster? So Bitcoin sets a block creation rate of every 10 minutes. The proof of work is so hard that blocks are created in the system only once per 10 minutes. This is meant originally to allow this block to propagate through the entire network. Other currencies that have taken Bitcoin's source code have copied it and have used different times. For example, Litecoin uses a 2.5 minutes block creation rate. fast coin uses 12 seconds, and so on. So what we wanted to do is to know is what is the effect of this. Can we really speed up the block acceptance to higher rates, which will allow us to process transactions faster in some sense? Or does this get dangerous with time? So here's what I'm going to try and explain broadly. If we're trying to go to high transaction rates, we have basically two ways of doing this. The first approach is to use larger blocks, right? We can just try and put more transactions in every block. Therefore, we're going to process more per second. The second way to do it is to increase the block creation rate, just like I've shown you that other currencies have done. And what I'm going to argue is that both of these cause more forks in the blockchain to form, right? So higher block creation rates basically mean that before you propagate a block, another one is created really quickly somewhere in the network. Larger blocks are simply harder to propagate. If I have a block that is 1 gigabyte and I need to transmit it to my neighbor, it takes longer. So propagation is very slow. And again, I'm going to have more blocks created at some point, at some distant point in the network. And the final piece is that I'm going to argue is that when we have more forks in the blockchain, the security of Bitcoin suffers to the point where we cannot really have higher transaction rates. The system will collapse. Okay, so in order to show you that large blocks have really longer propagation times, we're lucky to have data collected by Christian Decker and Roger Wattenhofer from ETH that actually measured the block propagation times in Bitcoin. And you can see that as block sizes grow, and this is data I think that's already more than 1 year old, the time to reach 25%, 50%, or 75% of the network really goes up. And it is very, very high relatively to what you would expect. So maybe 30 seconds to reach 75% of the network for blocks that are 350 kilobyte.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
So what they do is they connect a Bitcoin node to a lot of machines, and they look for when they get the message about receiving a block. So this is an estimate. This is not accurate because you don't really know when they receive the block, and you don't really know when the block is created. But having this linear relation with the growing block size really basically tells you that this is pretty accurate in some sense. And of course, the network could have changed since their measurements, so we don't really know if it still takes 35 seconds or not. There are also indications that it could be worse, that the network is smaller because of the bandwidth costs, that people are dropping out and there are less nodes that have to supply more bandwidth.
Where do you meet is because they pay less address for creating new blocks?
Sorry? So why do
mechanism?
people drop out?
No, what is this mechanism that guarantees that it will not grow beyond some limit?
The block size? So it's hard-coded that the block size is bounded to 1 megabyte. So if you receive a block from someone else that's larger than 1 megabyte, you just discard it. You don't pass it to others, and you don't build other blocks on top of it. This essentially promises anybody that if he builds a block of size more than 1 megabyte, the rest of the system is going to ignore it.
Yeah, this is block size, but what guarantees that the total amount of bitcoins will not exceed?
Oh, so the total amount of bitcoins, I didn't get into that, but basically the log of transactions that you follow basically has you can think of a lineage of exactly a trace of all money, where it's been and where it's from the moment it was created. And you cannot create more than 21 million bitcoins, which is the cap, because you would have to show this path that goes back to where it was created. And you could very easily find conflicts if this is money that isn't really there. So this basically shows us that as blocks get larger, their distribution is really bad. And so what we would expect Bitcoin's blockchain to look like when the transaction rate is very high is something more of a tree-like shape, right? So blocks may be created in parallel to each other without hearing about each other and may just continue the same chain. So what you want to notice here is that because of this tree structure, the longest chain, which is the thing that is accepted by nodes as the current history, is growing at a much slower pace than the rate that we're creating blocks. So this is pretty bad for us. And this really helps an attacker. If an attacker wants to produce a longer chain than the longest one that we have, notice that if he is centralized, if he is communicating efficiently and can extend his own blocks efficiently, then he needs far fewer blocks to create a longer chain than he would otherwise have needed, right? So right now he needs less than half of the blocks in the entire network, and so less than half of the computational power, and he can still create a longer chain. So what this means is that the 50% attack, this attack that can always succeed if the attacker has more than 50% of the computational power, is really performed at lower thresholds. If I have maybe 20% of all computational power and the tree is really wide, I can very easily replace all the longest blocks. And this is the threat to the security. So now what we've done in the paper, and that I have absolutely no time to describe, is that we plug in estimates from the Decker's and Wattenhofer's paper, and we get to bounds of maybe 40 transactions per second or 10 transactions per second, where the security of Bitcoin starts to suddenly drop. And we don't see any way that Bitcoin can really grow at its current form to the Visa scale. I'll just note that compressing blocks helps a little bit. Maybe it gives you a factor of 10 or 15, 16. But this already is the limit, I think. There's no more that block compression can help. So now I want to show you our very small change to the protocol. This will be pretty much my last slide, or one before last, and how we can recover back the security guarantees even when the network is very inefficient and builds something like very wide trees. So instead of picking the longest chain, we're going to do something else. We're going to pick a different history that is not necessarily the longest chain. And the rule that's going to help us to pick the history is called the greedy heaviest observed subtree rule. Okay, so we nicknamed it Ghost. So the greedy heaviest subtree rule basically says start at the first block. Every time you reach a conflict, you need to decide between in a fork of the network which one is the one you accept. Look at the heaviest subtree instead of the longest chain. This is a very simple change, right? So when I reach block A and I say there are two different versions of what comes next, I basically look at the size of the whole tree. I say B is larger than B prime, right? The subtree under B is larger than the subtree under B prime, so I will pick B. And again, at B, I will probably pick this one because it has 3 nodes following it, and the version of history I will accept will be one of these two. And notice that the longest chain was actually here, and I did not pick it. So what does that give us? An attacker that now wants to try and convince us to change one of our decisions. Maybe here he says, don't pick A, pick something else. He wants to switch to a different version of history, has to beat the size of this entire subtree. He has to produce more blocks, not just more than the longest chain, but actually more than the entire subtree, which is actually of a size that is built by the entire network, right? The entire network has been generating blocks here, so it's going to be very hard. Unless he has 50% of the computational power, he's not going to be able to do it. Okay, so again, we recover this guarantee that Satoshi initially promised us, that this 50% attack really requires 50% of the computational power. All right, so I will skip this in the interest of time, but I'll just say that you can also use this to speed up block creation rate, maybe have 1 block per second. But there are other problems that we do not handle other than the security problem. Ghost itself has already been implemented as kind of an inside the next generation protocol that kind of extends Bitcoin and tries to follow it up. It's something called Aetherium. I have no time to go into what Aetherium actually does, but it's a very interesting attempt to build a platform for decentralized applications. And so I'll just conclude to say that I hope I convinced you that money does really grow on trees, unlike what we were told as children. And I think the scalability question is really important. Bitcoin can be scaled up to some degree, but just not to Visa's scale just yet. Even with Ghost, we do not get to Visa's scale. We just recover some of the security that we lose along the way, but we get maybe to around 200 transactions per second, 250 at the current state of the network. However, we are still optimistic. We have a lot more improvements along the way in the pipeline. We think we can get to Visa scale and maybe even pass it in the protocol. And I'll thank you at this point.
What you suggest basically means that even if I reject some blocks, I still keep them and transmit them further in order to prove that to make others choose the same subtree?
Yes.
If I choose just one path, then if I only transmit that further, then it seems that the subtree isn't as heavy as it really is.
That's right. So you don't have to actually transmit the whole block. It's actually enough to transmit just the block header, which is 80 bytes, very small. And that already contains the evidence that there was a hard proof of work in there. And you don't have to, since you're not accepting the block contents anyway, you're throwing them away, you don't need to send that. But at least the block headers is something very easy.
Scales well?
Right, so think of creating a block per second and sending 80 bytes per block. So 80 bytes per second, that's not a problem, right?
Thanks.
All right.
But the heaviest block may change over time, so you have to keep all these blocks in storage.
Right, so you keep the headers of blocks that you didn't, right? You have a chain that works, that you're considering as the current one, right? Maybe this one. And you keep the headers of all blocks in the system from way back in time, right? 80 bytes, think of 80 bytes per second, but 80 bytes per second is maybe even an optimistic rule, right? Bitcoin currently builds a block per 10 minutes, every 10 minutes. So think of maybe 80 bytes per minute. From the dawn of time, right? For 5 years of Bitcoin use, for example, this is not very substantial. This is a very small amount of data. And you don't have to keep a lot of it. It's because most of the network actually adopts your point of view after a while. If the subtree gets really heavy, everybody switches to work on that subtree. It keeps being the heaviest one.
You have two subtrees that are in constant competition, and that you could actually change the entire course of history.
Yes.
At a flick of a second.
Right. So something like that we analyze this in the paper, and we show that these races don't go on for very long, that they collapse one way or another. Because block creation is randomized, it's very hard for these two trees to be synchronized exactly to build extra blocks at the same time. Okay?
I guess that, well, since you are still keeping the blocks that lost in this competition, but do you have an estimation about the bound of on how many blocks I still need to keep?
Yes. So I can't really recall from the top of my head, but basically it depends on two parameters: the block creation rate and the delay in the network. So think of something of the order of their multiplication. If the delay is very high and I create blocks at a very high rate, then I might have these collapses taking a longer time, and I need something that scales up with this multiplier with the multiplication of lambda and d, lambda being the block creation rate and d being the delay. So the paper has more details exactly about this. And I'll just say maybe that I also think we can solve this problem of collapse. You were talking about two racing trees. We actually think we can avoid even waiting that for the trees to collapse in order to accept transactions. All right.
Thank you again.